All right, welcome everybody. My name is Lorraine Fournier, and I'm the lead curator for C Magazine's Curious Criticism program. And I just want to let you know that we are recording tonight's session. Thank you all, wherever you are, for joining us today or tonight for Expanding Criticism Through Accessibility, a conversation between Sean Lee and Amanda Cachia. This is part of the symposium organized by C Magazine, a triannual periodical that provides compelling commentary on art and its contexts. The symposium brings together writers, critics, artists, curators, and other thinkers to take up these questions in relation to their many practices of reflecting on contemporary art and culture. With a focus on form, the symposium plays on curious as a method as well as a descriptor for certain creative critical leanings. This series seeks to facilitate deep, meaningful, relevant engagement with the objects, images, texts, and experiences that we encounter in contemporary art, considering all the while what it means to do so in the midst of global crises. You can see the full list of events on C Magazine's website, which we will post to the chat shortly here. We're also offering a 33% discount on subscriptions for attendees of today's programs. So if the work we do means something to you, visit special.cmagazine.com to claim this offer. The conversation tonight will run for approximately 40 minutes, followed by 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. And we strongly encourage you to add questions to the chat at any point, and I will bring those to Sean and Amanda to take up. And you can be submitting those at any point in the conversation. Before we get started, I'd also like to acknowledge that C Magazine's offices are located in Toronto, or Toronto, a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, which is said to refer to the wooden stakes that were used as fishing wires in the narrows of local river systems by the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat peoples. These lands are also the traditional and ancestral territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Anishinaabeg, all of whom are original custodians of these lands. Bearing in mind the complexities of acknowledging the land in the midst of an ongoing colonial project, that is so-called Canada, we continue to do so at C Magazine as an expression of gratitude for our hosts, and in an effort to encourage our audiences to embody this acknowledgement in their daily lives in all of the ways that are possible for them. So turning to tonight's conversation. In this conversation, Sean Lee and Amanda Cachia discuss ways that critical disability and accessibility practices enable new or different methods of approaching, understanding, and responding to art through writing or other textual practices. They consider the ways that a nuanced and complicated understanding of mad, deaf, and disabled artists and their work allow for new kinds of access to criticism more broadly, whether for those who are underrepresented or those for whom contemporary art and criticism does not seem particularly welcome or accessible, whether historically or in the present. Together, they brainstorm ways of doing criticism, and approaching art that give rise to this kind of world and work. The conversation pays attention to the poetics opened up by disability cultures, as well as formal strategies used not only by art writers, but also institutions such as galleries and museums with their catalogues, didactic panels, wayfinding, and so on. This event will be live translated into American Sign Language, and as with all Curious Criticism events, include captions produced by Zoom's auto transcription feature. Amanda Cachia, she, her, is a curator and critic from Sydney, Australia. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary art, curatorial studies and activism, exhibition design and access, decolonizing the museum, and the politics of embodied disability language in visual culture. She is currently working on 2 book projects, a monograph based on her dissertation entitled Disability Art Agency, Participation and the Revision of the Senses through Duke University Press, as well as the edited volume Curating Access, Disability, Art, Activism, and Creative Accommodation. Cachia currently teaches art history, visual culture, and curatorial studies at Otis College of Art and Design, the California Institute of the Arts, California State University, Long Beach, and California State University, San Marcos. And I will copy the presenters' full bios in the chat shortly. I'm shortening them a little bit here for time's sake. Sean Lee, he, him, or they, them, is an artist and curator exploring the assertion of disability art as the last avant-garde. His methodology explores crip curatorial practices as a means to resist traditional aesthetic idealities. They hold a BA in Arts Management and Studio from the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and is currently the Director of Programming at Tangled Art and Disability. Previous to this role, they were Tangled's inaugural Curator in Residence in 2016 and Tangled's Gallery Manager in 2017. Additionally, Lee is an independent lecturer, speaker, and moderator, adding his insights and perspectives to conversations surrounding disability arts across Canada, the United States, and internationally. And I will copy Sean's full bio in the chat as well. So I will now turn things over to Amanda and Sean. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight.
Well, hello, everybody. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Amanda.
Thanks, Lauren and C Magazine for inviting us to have this conversation. I just wanted to start off by acknowledging where I'm based and the lands that I'm on. So I'm in San Diego in Southern California, which is the lands of the Khmer people. And I also want to give a quick self-description. So I am a short-statured white woman with brown curly hair resting on top of my head at the moment. I'm wearing black rimmed spectacles and a yellow t-shirt. I'm sitting in my office. I have a colorful painting behind me hanging on the wall. There's some drapes that are framing a window. Outside we can see flowers and plants and so on.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I am also going to just give a self-description. So I'm Sean. I'm the Director of Programming at Tangled, which is based in Toronto on Treaty 13 territory. Just to describe myself, I am male presenting, but I use he or they pronouns. I'm an East Asian Chinese person with light skin, and I'm visibly disabled. My back curves, my shoulders are uneven, and like Amanda, I am also quite short of stature. I have kind of like shoulder length, maybe a little bit longer than that, black hair. And I'm wearing these like steampunk glasses. They're green with like gold rims that float on the frames. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I'm in my dining room. There's kind of like a shelf behind me, some plants, and a painting. So yeah, that is my description. Amanda, where do you want to start with our conversation today?
Yeah, there's a couple of things floating through my head, so I'll just go ahead and like start by commenting on a few different areas. I've been really thinking a lot about this panel because, you know, typically we're so ensconced, at least my work as an art historian and a curator is ensconced in visual images. And unfortunately, vision being like at the top of the, you know, the hierarchy of the senses, we tend to like, you know, wade in those waters most often. And in my practice, I really try and, you know, invite a much more multisensorial approach and try and flatten that hierarchy so that the other senses are invited into conversation. And that includes text, which then has repercussions for, you know, criticism, which is the topic of this panel. And so the only thoughts that I had were, well, there's several. The first is that last week I was emailed by an old professor of mine at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. And she said, Amanda, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. And she said, that's because now that we're in the era of Zoom, that lots and lots of, Sean and I just demonstrated, you know, this idea of image description of ourselves on the screen. And my professor said that she's encountering that more and more often. and that it seems to become more normalized. And she felt like, I was talking about these practices 10 years ago, and that now Zoom has kind of propelled us into this era where it's much more common. And I'm kind of wondering how image description and self-description and verbal description, all of that has become more normalized. And I'm wondering how that can be used to feed our work as art critics and curators and writers. And for me, at least as an art educator, I try and use that as a means in which to heighten and broaden my students' ability to analyze. Because also I should say that when we're describing ourselves, it's also a political act, because we're choosing to identify the color of our skin or our gender or our pronouns or our ethnicities. And also showcasing an element of our personal lives. Like, now you all know that I have art in my house. So it's just all of those aspects that I'm wondering whether there's definitely pros, because it heightens our level to analyze, and it also becomes activist in the, being politicizing ourselves in a way. But I'm also wondering what the potential downfalls are of that. So that's one kind of conversation point. But the next thing is, as a curator of promoting accessible art practices, there of course is a lot of, in my exhibition design and conversations with artists, and Lauren mentioned the word wayfinding, is that, oftentimes label copy is translated into other forms. So first of all, you have your image description, or you might have, guidelines for visitors on how to navigate or interact with or engage with a work of art, whether that's through, tactile means or sonic means, etc. And also the translation might be offered in Braille, for instance. So there's multiple formats that I've been testing, and also not actually dispensing with the catalog, the exhibition catalog completely. As Lauren mentioned, the exhibition catalog too. So, or if there is an exhibition catalog, we as critics need to think as well about the multisensorial access to a catalog. So if you're writing text, then that text needs to be available, text-to-speech technology. So it needs to be available in an audio format, or even it needs to be available in formats that we haven't even considered yet. So I guess I would advocate then that, maybe this accessibility approach is actually enriching and making certainly more complicated, but more deepening the complexity and the challenge of this work. So they're my initial thoughts.
Those are incredible initial thoughts, Amanda. And it's really interesting what you said about a past professor emailing you and sort of saying like, oh, I sort of am more and more encountering these practices that are being kind of, recognized as valuable and being recognized as, ways of altering the social configurations that we participate in, right? And it's so, I think it's just, it's very poetic in a way that these processes, these protocols are happening in this time now. As you've mentioned, disabled folks have been advocating for, descriptions, for ASL, for captioning, for access, really, not just, in these kinds of ways, but also in being able to work from home and having more flexible hours, a lot of things that the pandemic has sort of made central in our day-to-day in this moment. And I think it's important to just think about the way that disabled folks have really been the ones leading that conversation, like when we give a description, when we describe ourselves, I think we are enacting that political sense of, who is in this space and who's also leading these conversations and leading, the sort of process around creating access on the terms of disabled people. I think there's something really nice about this sort of hacktivist spirit, if you will, of like trying to create accessibility from, the spirit of creating hospitality for one another. And as disability justice activists would say, orienting away from compliance-based access to access as an act of love, as an act of hospitality, and as an act of establishing relationships with one another. And I think that's where I kind of want to consider, as you were mentioning, the ways that access and some of the what are some of the potential pitfalls of access as it becomes mainstreamed and also potentially co-opted. And I had a really interesting experience actually that I maybe can bring up without mentioning any names, but I think you've coined this term creative access, which I think is absolutely wonderful. It talks about the generative meaning making that can happen through accessibility in our exhibitions. And I've been seeing curators really interested in taking on creative access without a commitment to the politics of disability and a commitment to like disability justice in ways that would, I think, be really meaningful. I think folks are really interested in, the language of creative access, tapping into kind of familiar ways of establishing what is kind of quote unquote artistic excellence, or establishing disability arts in kind of normative frameworks. And how can we challenge that, not just in our in the exhibitions that we program, but also in trying to understand the criticism, the art criticism that is kind of written about or not written about these possibilities, right? I remember in 2020, Yolanda Bonnell, for the theater piece Bug, had asked critics to only write about their show if they were Indigenous as well, or came from the BIPOC community. And I wonder if those are important things to consider when we open up our shows to the public, and just what the level of didacticism has to be sometimes. I think historically we've been told, as artists in art school, like didacticism tends to be bad. Like let the artwork, quote unquote, speak for itself. But I think, when there are histories that need to be challenged, when there are assumptions that need to be challenged like this, like perhaps didacticism isn't so bad, and perhaps there are different ways of doing art that need to be considered when a critic is coming to speak to a piece. And so those are kind of considerations I have as we think about, the conversation of disability art shifting from, disabled folks can compete too, and the work we do is just as good. And I think we're going into a place of understanding that, like, this is a really inaccessible environment that we're creating art in. And what does it mean to contort ourselves to the values and to the time frames and the sort of like ableist, frameworks that we encounter in our day-to-day. So what does it mean to push back, and how can we kind of reconcile with the art system that we participate in?
That's such an excellent comment. And I want to piggyback off what you were just saying, Sean, by I'm going to screen share for a moment, because I came across this really wonderful talk by the visual artist and art critic, Joseph Grigley, he's based at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And he was giving this lecture, and Joseph is a deaf man, and he was giving this talk and he was using voice. And there's kind of a politics attached to that as well. But his entire talk was actually, the script of his talk was projected on the wall. And that was his way of kind of giving an access point. So, and he had ASL interpreting as well, but he also was really insistent on putting that text on the wall so that his talk was provided in multiple forms. But something else about if you actually, it's a 42-minute lecture. So if you, and I can provide the link for this in the chat for folks to actually, but if you listen to this talk, he's actually making all of what Sean's saying completely clear. He's talking about how he was invited to give this talk at this particular event, and that he was hesitant because he wasn't sure if all of the access components that he needed would be available and would be present. And then he goes about and explains how he's had so many different challenges and barriers in the past to giving these talks. And Joseph is a really well-respected writer and art critic who's spent a long time kind of talking about didactics and exhibitions and all of the, what he calls exhibition prosthetics. He has a wonderful book on this as well. But I just found his talk to be really frank. And yeah, I'll go ahead and share that link right there. And just really honest, like he spends a long time in the beginning just saying, this is what it took for me to be here. Like, this is what it took for me to be at this event. And oftentimes he states that he says, no, I don't actually want to come to your event. And he said that he finds it frustrating because rather than talking to folks who invite him to such events about, you know, maybe some more of the interesting elements, he said he has to engage in Disability 101 and advocate for himself on why interpretation is important, for instance. This event that we're at right now, that Sean and I are at right now, has multiple access points, which is really important and fantastic. But maybe even several years ago, this would not have been an automatic access point. Like Sean and I might have had to advocate for that as well. So I really enjoy how, you know, Joseph is talking about all of those things really in a more transparent way that Sean was suggesting just now.
Oh, thanks for sharing that link, Amanda. I'm definitely going to have to check out this talk afterwards.
It's really great. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, it's so interesting that we are in a place where I think more and more we can set the terms of what sort of, you know, events we participate in. You know, there was a time where disability arts was really quite nascent and had no profile at all, I would say. And more I think it's becoming recognized in more formalized art, you know, capital A art circles. And it makes me wonder, though, to what degree is this art, how can we continue to push who is being centered in these conversations? Because I still do notice, you know, even within the work that I do, we haven't very successfully been able to bring in artists who are labeled with intellectual disabilities, for instance, and being able to speak to your work, to write your grants in a way that fits into the normative assumptions of like who an artist, quote unquote, is still really valued. And how can we resist some of those normative ways that we fall into the system as the profile of disability arts kind of is raised, is I think a question that I always have in my mind, you know. And one example that I want to give, which was, I think, really valuable to me with in understanding like the experiments and the failures that occur with you know, disability arts, is the idea of kind of how we create invitational spaces. You know, I think there was in 2019, Tangled partnered with Bodies in Translation and Ryerson University or X University and Harborfront Center to put on the Cripping the Arts Symposium. And one of the criticisms for the first year that Eliza had mentioned to me was that, it still was a symposium, even if it was free and even if it was, ASL translated and had captioning, like it still was a lot of academics. And so even if you put the invitation out to folks, a lot of it is still going to be inaccessible. So the next year or the next Cripping the Arts, what was created was a language glossary kind of guide that was developed with the community from Soul Express, which is a group that is dedicated to artists who are labeled with intellectual disabilities. And so we created this glossary, which I think came from really good intentions. But the question was sort of, like, is this enough? Does this become an invitation, or does it become sort of the window dressing? And I think for some, the glossary was extremely helpful. It was wonderful to help those who were maybe unfamiliar with a symposium navigate a space like that. But, what kind of commitment can we take to go beyond, this idea of a symposium having to speak in a certain way or lecture in a certain way? Like how can we break some of those barriers down? And that was something I'm really interested in the possibilities of art criticism doing, because we still, I think, have these assumptions that the art critic comes from some place of, power and authority to speak to the merit of the work. And I think maybe that's a really problematic way that that is still largely how a lot of folks approach art criticism. And yeah, I think there's a lot of messy thoughts in my head about how we can kind of work to resist those notions. But I think just from the link that you shared, it was really wonderful to see others kind of sharing these thoughts.
Yeah, and of course, I just gave that sort of example because Joseph also is very interested in these ideas that we're touching upon today, and he's also a critic, and it's published, numerous books, etc. But there's also, of course, artists who are making work about this too. I'm going to share screen again because this image came to mind. This is a work by, well, it's not actually a work. Pat MacArthur is an artist based in New York, and she had a big installation of her work back in 2016 at the Chisenhall Gallery in London. And excuse me, as I was going through the space, I noticed that there were these heaters, and they were there because she was cold as she was installing. And I just love that she left them there as a trace of, is this space accommodating or not? Sort of saying that she needed that, and that's her body's needs. And I really liked that a lot. Excuse me. So that's one thought that I had right there. I'm going to go ahead and stop share. But I also wanted to talk about the project that I'm currently working on, which is the edited volume. And it's the reason that it's so important is because it's happening now, and it's been about a year in process that I've been working on this edited volume. And I have over 30 authors in this book, and Sean is one of them. And it's been really interesting because all of the authors have different disabilities. Not all of them, but some of them identify. Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. So some of them have different kinds of vision impairments. And as they're working through using Microsoft Word to write their chapter essays, some of them are really struggling with the software. And that's because the software isn't fully accessible to them, or if there are modes of access in the software, it's super complicated. And they're turning to me as the editor as a kind of, I'm just thinking of what Sean's saying about as the critic is like the person who is like the gatekeeper and decides, you know, from a so-called objective perspective on what is worth showing or worth discussing. And in my case, as the editor, what is worth printing or publishing. And so I'm there to steer them and to navigate for their needs in this publishing world, to publish their writing. And they really, it's much more demanding and complicated than I was prepared for. So I just wanted to give you like a solid, you know, real world example of my experience right now, working with 30 authors, some of which are disabled. And I also decided, because it was such a mammoth task for me to work on this publication, to hire an outside editor. And so now my outside editor has been invaluable for me. And I mean, mind you, this has come at a great cost, but for me, it's like, where do you invest in the things that are sort of critical? But what I've also then found is that my hired editor was also very unfamiliar with working with disabled authors. And so in my activism now within my editing, with my editing hat on, I've said to her, why don't you consider, she has a fabulous website and I'm happy to share it with folks in the chat, but I'm asking her to consider thinking of ways to market herself so that she's more accessible to disabled folks, right? So folks who clearly have a need for additional help and not just, you know, grammar or punctuation or development of ideas, but just navigating the world of using Microsoft Word or other online applications for folks who find that really difficult. So I hope I'm making sense with what I'm saying here. And she loved the idea and said, yes, I need to think about how to incorporate disabilities in editing and offering those skills or offering those needs to folks that aren't able to navigate the online world very easily. So that's one thought. But then the other thought I had was about, I was asked I had a conversation, I had a lecture yesterday in Florida, and during the conversation, there was a question at the end from somebody who said, we know that the merits of the online world have been really profound for disabled people, but however, does that mean that we'll never go back into a museum ever again? That now that museums realize the benefits of the online world and the benefits of programming and, you know, the benefits of what it might bring also to criticism, does that mean we'll forget having that embodied experience in the museum? To which I would love to hear what folks here say about that. But to which I said, well, I don't think that the museum will be replaced, because you're still going to be getting multi-sensorial information inside the physical embodied space of the museum. So we can't simply rely on all of the image of Zoom or the text in the chat. I was actually starting to think, what do I do when I go back to teaching? Because I love the chat. And so what happens when I have that absence of a chat in the classroom? Because we're so now used to having that layering of text or meta text in our communication. But I think that the world is now being shaped into like a hybrid form. And I'm kind of curious to see how that also will then expand criticism and writing as well.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to share my screen for once. I want to bring up an example of what Tangled's been doing recently. So this is a photo from Instagram, from the Tangled Instagram. It's a photo that one of our artists for the show Undeliverable, Jess Sash, took of me in front of what looks like 5. There's actually 6 of the word undeliverable, just kind of drawn on in black on the gallery. And this is, I want to talk a bit about this show because it's the first one since we've come back from the pandemic. And there were a lot of things that we wanted to think through, including, how can we take on some of the learnings that we've had from the pandemic and continue to apply it in a way that feels generative, but also it doesn't feel that it feels kind of like returning to a different sense of normal. And one of the things that we did was that during the install process, we wanted to really try to make sure that we it was the show was about reclaiming the museum on the terms of the disabled body mind. It was curated by Carmen Papalia. And one of the things that we sort of discussed as a group was just about trying to, not center around deliverables. That was something that a lot of artists said, they felt a lot of pressure around being in museum spaces. And so during this process, we realized the artist statements wouldn't be arriving on time. And we actually fully embraced that. And we put the word undeliverable anywhere that an artwork that a statement was supposed to be there, but not there. And there's a really lovely post kind of expanding on it, but I wanted to talk about just, these new paradigms that we can participate in and we have the energy to use. There's another photo of an iPad on a tripod and like in front of some art pieces, and that's a tour that we now offer at Tangled, and I think we'll continue to offer, is the possibility of doing some Zoom guided tours, because you get an opportunity to really speak to somebody and participate with someone as you tour a space. And that we've gotten some really valuable feedback, and folks seem really excited about the possibility of being able to join digitally, but also geographically from other spaces. On the other hand, there were works in this show. There's a piece here that says the possibilities of care as a sculpture. And this piece, Aslan Thomas had generated as a way of, trying to center the scent-free space at Tangled. And so these digital opportunities also give us a chance to offer different modes of participating. If someone's scented, for instance, we might actually suggest that they not come in, and we can give them a digital tour instead. But it means that they miss out on some other possibilities. Like there's somebody here listening to a piece by Jessica Karuhanga, and with the work, there's actually a vibrating belt with the musical score. And so I wanted to share some photos here because it kind of showcases the complexity of us as we try to balance this hybrid with the experimental, with access, and with also trying to, underscore the need for care and the need to do things differently. And there's a whole balance here that we're trying to find. And I think, this was a really interesting show to embody some of those qualities.
That looks so exciting and wonderful. I would be curious to hear how it's been received so far. Do you have good feedback?
We've had some excellent feedback. And what's interesting is a lot of the authors of, writing around this show have said, we highly recommend doing the guided tour because in some ways this show was actually built for that. And in some ways it offers a different experience and potentially a better experience for some. And so this started off as really just an experiment that we as at Tangled wanted to do. I was like, we have iPads and we have tripods, so we can just try it out. But I think it's going to be something that we continue to refine and continue to improve on, but we'll definitely continue to offer.
That sounds great. It's giving me a lot of ideas. I do have a show that I'm curating next fall at the San Diego State University, and I'm working with students to curate a disability-related exhibition. And I really want to implement some of, these qualities, I guess, characteristics of your show. I think that sounds really awesome. So I'll have to bring you in, Sean, as a consultant and talk with my students about that kind of the hybrid space that we're now facing and how to utilize the benefits of each world and successfully, and feel maybe that will in fact make it even a more accessible experience for folks, which would be amazing. It's funny because in my presentations, I've been talking about access components from exhibitions that I've organized, years ago. And back then they seemed really innovative and progressive. And now they're like, oh yeah, that's kind of standard. That really has become more normalized. I just want to go back to a comment, Sean, that you were mentioned earlier, which was kind of touching on some of the problems, I guess, or the challenges. You were talking about how maybe there is creative access being implemented in exhibitions, but there is like a piecemeal, I can't quite remember the words you used, but not a piecemeal approach, but maybe there wasn't like a fully thought through activation of that idea, that it was more just lip service. Can you go over that a little bit more again and maybe provide an example of what you mean?
Right. I think what I was talking about was an excitement for creative access to, like commission artists to do experimental access components to an art piece, but then not commit to, ASL, for instance, because it's too expensive, or captions because it's too expensive. And I think there's like, as you were saying, creative access, and all of the accessibility components that we have to our shows are also political and very much about a commitment to disability as like a difference that matters. And so I think more and more as access practices become mainstream, I want to think about how we can resist this desire to essentially like tokenize access as only an aesthetic, but actually, use it as a way of interrogating relational ways of understanding one another and access and disability.
That reminds me of how some artists now are actually distributing. It's kind of like what Joseph Grigley was talking about in the talk that he gave, but basically being very transparent about, here are my needs in order for me to be able to be present in this exhibition or this, talk. And it's so artists are distributing what they call access writers, which you may be familiar with. And so different people have been doing that. Joanna Hedver is one who I'm actually publishing her access writer in my edited volume. And it's basically just saying, I need, 2-3 days to rest. And then I'm able to, and explaining why she needs all of that. And it's interesting because there was, I heard rumors that there was, there was a big show that just opened and it had a lot of disabled artists in it. And the artists were kind of flown to the museum for the opening, and it was lots of fun. And there was a great generative conversations, but there was very little thought around actually what it means to bring in a group of disabled artists to a large scale event. And so the access writer, if there was one, wasn't really discussed or brought into the, into that experience. And that kind of what you're saying, Sean, that reminds me very much of how, okay, this is exciting to try and bring disability art into the formal mainstream art history, canon, so to speak, but the access components really need to be addressed as well as very much hand in hand, part and parcel of, curating this kind of work. So I hope that makes sense to folks. Have we reached the end? Do we need to open it up for questions?
Yeah, I don't know if how we should address the question. Lauren, do you want to give us questions to address, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to facilitate that. We have just one comment so far from an anonymous attendee. Notes, as a note on deliverables, I'm currently working at a place that is experimenting and focusing less on a deliverable and more on supporting knowledge growth. And coincidentally, it has been the workplace that is the most supportive of me despite severe mental health issues. and it's led me to feel truly valued for my capabilities for the first time.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think the art world is pretty inaccessible, and something that Tangled has been trying to develop is a clause trying to form. I think a lot of things sometimes are also about formalization, right? Like Amanda, the Access rider that you had referenced, I think is a formal way of kind of just better understanding someone's access needs. I think people have been doing it for disability arts. People have been doing it for a long time, but there hasn't been language. Once there's a power, I think, to assigning language sometimes. And so Tangled's trying to develop a care clause of some sort for our contracts where we work with our artists. So trying to, emphasize that the prioritization of what we do at Tangled is not the deliverables in a contract, but rather the artist's safety, health, capacity. And so that everything in the contract, even after it's signed, is negotiable and is meant to prioritize the artist first. So it's something that I think we want to continue to develop and give language to, because that's really important, and it helps us create a sea change in our arts culture. The more and more people are participating in access and recognizing their own access needs, I think is very important for making this cultural shift.
I will say, I mean, just speaking from a personal perspective, we can put language to these embodied experiences that we probably were too hesitant or too nervous to reveal before, especially in professional settings. I find that there's a lot more comfort. There seems to be more open and acceptance of that. But I also kind of think, and I'm only speaking from personal experience, but there is like a coming out moment in being able to do that. So while I have a visible disability, I also have invisible disabilities, like a lot of back pain, mental health issues that I don't talk about, but I'm starting to feel more comfortable talking about, because I feel like we're in an environment now where it's more accepted. And so I think that it's just good to kind of acknowledge that as well. Like, how do we put language to experiences of invisible disabilities in a professional context? And it seems like there's a lot of really good examples that we're talking about today. Are there any more comments or questions?
Yes, we have a couple more questions that have come through. So one question also from Anonymous. Hi there. An access question I often encounter at the place where I work is how to navigate captioning in abstraction / ambivalence in media works, so video and sound. I'm wondering if you have experiences or references you may share about how to promote better accessibility for complex sound or video works. Thank you for the wonderful talk.
To clarify, I think for me, when I've experienced artists doing experiments with captioning, for instance, in order to capture kind of a richer quality of the captions, I've seen them done in a number of ways. But recently, I worked with Valentin Brown to create captioning for a poetry piece, in which Valentin created these really beautiful captions, like very much in the aesthetic of Valentin's own drawings and paintings and 2D work. Valentin really treated the captions as an extension of the art piece, but also of the artistic style. So I think that might be a possibility. It's definitely more work and more planning. I'll put the example of what this video I'm talking about is into the chat. But yeah, that's a strategy that I've seen where folks will try to, capture the style and the essence of, the oral quality of a video piece by integrating sometimes like messy or sometimes almost uh sometimes almost inaccessible captions, because the sound is kind of in that space. And so what is really honoring, that piece, I think sometimes folks expect access to be very clean and very cut, like, but it doesn't have to be. It can be messy, and it can actually ask us to consider, the aesthetic of the piece overall. And I see, Amanda, you've included quite a couple examples too.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really great work happening right now on captioning. There was a big show that was curated by Christine Sun Kim, who's a deaf artist, and it was called Activating Captions. And so if you look at that site, you can see all these types of interesting kind of textual work, critical work with captioning. And Liza Silvestri is one of those artists who's also interested in embedding captioning and the practice of captioning and questioning captioning and the consistencies and complexities of that in their work. And Christine Sun Kim as well herself actually also uses captions in really interesting ways and idiosyncratic ways.
Thank you both. Another question, maybe to kind of add on to this, from Anonymous asks, one problem with many art historical frameworks that critics often use is a methodological and conceptual investment in vision and visuality. Do you feel there is a way to engage these art historical discourses without contributing to the hierarchization of senses that you earlier described? That's another great question.
Well, that's kind of like the very topic of my monograph that I'm trying to, uncover, is like the importance of activating the other senses so that we can kind of flatten that hierarchy of vision. And, the way that I, utilize and demonstrate these ideas is through the disabled artists that I examine, such as Christine Sun Kim, Alison O'Daniel, Liza Silvestri, Carmen Papalia that Sean mentioned earlier. All of these folks are really kind of trying to show that it's not just vision, but art history tends to be a little conservative, I find. So I'm starting to think of ways of, bridging. It's very challenging working in this field within art history, I find. I don't know if Sean agrees with me on this, but I think that the way that I try and draw in and deepen the conversation is by looking to other minority identity positions and building allyship, and then also bringing in conversations around visual culture, which is a very different kind of methodological framework, but I think still has resonance for what we're trying to do in merging disability and art together.
Yeah, it's so interesting because that hierarchy is both something that we are trying to resist and participate in at the same time. And so it can be really complex to try to like separate those two. Sometimes even with disability artists, right? Access is not inherent in the work that we necessarily do. I think a lot of the ways that disability artists have been, the way that we experience our disability just because of the way that mainstream society understands disability means that we're oftentimes in a place of discovery in our art practice and trying to unlearn a lot of the hierarchies that exist. And so we're in a place of, I think, trying to undo a lot of the learning that we've done. And it's a really good question. There's a lot of conceptual ways that I think artists are dealing with these art historical frameworks. But I think a part of it is just continuing to understand for instance, Amanda's like creative access framework for approaching disability arts and access. So I think, yeah.
And part of my work too, I should add, is like in terms of my monograph, is trying to uncover the ways that I love that Lauren mentioned the word wayfinding earlier, because I'm actually arguing that these disabled artists who are, while they're also trying to dismantle the hierarchy of the census, they're also providing us with alternatives to exhibition wayfinding, some of which we've discussed today. But if we dig deep into the art history textbooks, which I'm trying to do right now, in between, feeding my toddler and other real life challenges, is that basically, back in the 60s and 70s, and even, going back to the surrealists, they were experimenting already with providing us with alternatives to experiencing an exhibition, for instance. And they were, even something as simple as you could adjust yourself the height of the painting hanging on the wall with this kind of neat pulley system. This was all designed by an artist. And so I guess and it was considered really experimental and avant-garde when they did that, but it didn't stick. It didn't become a normalized, it was more just an experiment, but it wasn't something that we see today still in museums. So I'm trying to sort of pull that conversation out, like the wayfinding, the way that we experience space in an exhibition, and how that might give us more tools to encourage art historians to look at these other formats instead of just purely vision.
So do you have the capacity for one more question? Sort of a big one. So we have, thank you for the insightful exchange, Amanda and Sean. I'm particularly curious how both of you approach accessibility in arts writing. Would you have ways to avoid talking to the arts ecosystem's echo chamber and facilitate better accessibility to those who are not interested in art as much as we are? So it almost seems like they're proposing accessibility approaches as a way of shaking up what can become an echo chamber of arts writing, and access, but also a way of like making art more welcoming, or perhaps more interesting to those who might not be the kind of folks who like say they love contemporary art.
Yeah, well, one kind of strategy that I employed in a recent publication, which was called El Alto. It was this publication that was a review of disability arts in the Americas. And because of the kind of connections that we were trying to create between different languages, we had a number of translations, but I think what was really interesting was we developed a website as part of it with a glossary, and the glossary was really trying to make connections between the language that's developed, between English and Spanish, for instance. And that was one approach that I'd taken. I'll put the link to this publication. It's called El Alto. Here, and Amanda made a contribution to the piece as well. I think there's a lot of different approaches that we can take that try not to replicate just the typical ways that we think of art writing. And one of them is to continue to question, what are the methods that we approach this writing with? Do we have multiple entry points?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I have an answer to the question. I was just thinking about how some of the artists I work with, they're, rather than being welcoming, they're actually intentionally antagonistic. But maybe through antagonism, they might reach a broader audience. I'm not really sure, because as we know, that the art world is sometimes can be very speak only to the elite and so on, and those who are educated with the tools for understanding this work. But that's it. I don't think I can respond other than that, just to know that there is a tension with the artists that I'm working with, But then in my own practice as a curator and as an editor and writer is like this tension between antagonism, like just being pissed off with the system versus trying to educate people and being welcoming and open-ended about that. And I don't know if that's going to go away anytime soon. I do want to acknowledge, by the way, and question in that somebody was saying that they're having, this happens all the time with my classes. So I really think we need to acknowledge that Zoom is glitching, and they would really like it if we were able to have all of this information available to them after the talk. Because, you know, just as a teacher, I'm always sending my students a gazillion, you know, ways of accessing the material. So.
Great. Well, thank you again to Sean and Amanda, and to all of you attendees again for joining us this evening, and to our ASL interpreters for doing such a wonderful job. Please take good care, and we hope to see you at our next event, a conversation between Tyrone Bestian and Jazz M. Morgan on criticism and aesthetic gatekeeping, which will actually be probably extending a lot of the conversations that have opened up tonight. That takes place on November 10th at 6 p.m. It's free and open to the public, as are all the events, and you can register to get the Zoom link through the link that I've just included here in the chat. We've also saved the chat from tonight, and this event is being recorded. I don't know C Magazine's policy yet about posting the recordings, but I'll certainly put it to them that it's important to make those materials accessible for folks after the event. So thanks, everybody.